Well, Scott Hahn, thanks for joining us today. Oh, Brandon McGinley. It is Right and Just is the book we're discussing today, written by Brandon and by Scott. And really, I'm just amazed that you have taken what I thought to be kind of ordinary Catholic publishing to quite a radical level.
Sure.
I mean,
Totally. This is like a manifest. I'm scared. When this hits the kind of Knights of Columbus market, I'm worried they're going to start to use their swords. Do they still have swords, or did they get rid of those?
They moved on to like berets and the kind of more mid 20th century.
You know, I know that they enjoyed their plumage.
Yeah,
but
I enjoyed the plumage.
The beret though is more frightening because it makes me think that they have like a very small gun.
Right. Well, exactly.
It just comes right out of their.
Yeah,
their,
like it's sort of. Oh well. Well, the Knights will have their reckoning. But yeah.
So I do want to get into the kind of the theoretics of this book as well. But for people out there who have not read this and should read this, you are making the claim that society needs the church.
Right.
And that the society is going to be failing in its achievement of justice, in its human flourishing, if it does not have true religion, Catholic religion. But you start off, and maybe I'm too obsessed about this, but you start off saying, you know, Marx is not all that bad. and it was just so interesting as I'm reading this and going through the book, I'm finding that I was thinking back to all the major Catholic apostolates of the last 20th century. And there was a lot of apologetics that rose and did a phenomenal job of bringing people into the church. And then there was a host of different, you know, apostolates that discipled Catholics and tried to bring them further into the faith. And without, I don't mean this to sound too uncharitable or too rude, it turned most devout Catholics into Republicans. Rather than into radical Catholics.
Sure.
And you are pivoting that in a major market right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, it's one of the theses that I come back to time and time again in my own work, and it is certainly at least implicit in here, is that we've gotten used to the idea, we have been basically catechized in the notion that kind of bog standard American politics, the options on the table in American politics are more or less completely compatible with Catholicism, and that being a good American in all of the senses in which that's traditionally understood is more or less coterminous with being a good Catholic. And so we end up in a situation where as the American mainstream shifts, and as what is considered mainstream in certain subsections of American life shifts, so goes the church and many of the institutions associated with her. And so you end up with things like right now, where, for instance, the two mainstreams in American Catholic politics are more or less completely satisfied with Joe Biden, or more or less completely satisfied with Donald Trump. And so, you know, we're trying to articulate, you know, we're starting with something that most American Catholics who take the faith seriously are going to say, oh, of course, the world needs religion. Oh, whoop-de-doo. You know, it's very, very typical, kind of very standard thing to say. But, you know, first of all, in the title, you had true religion right on there. And then help people to understand that what we think of when we say religion is completely formed by modern modes of thought and modern definitions. And instead of thinking, okay, yes, we do need religion, that's true, but that is actually a much more radical statement than we give it credit for.
So let's jump into it. How do you understand true religion?
Sure. So, you know, obviously the modern understanding of the word religion is basically any supernatural belief system. And, you know, and so we could talk of the many world religions, comparative religion, the religion departments at major universities, and as if it's a coherent, description of reality. And so we have basically imbibed that way of thinking. And so we think of Catholicism as being one religion among many, one that has perhaps a greater claim to truth than others, but is still sequestered conceptually in this space that we call religion, that is kind of an accessory or add-on to a flourishing human life. You could have it, you could not. Most people have something like a religion, but more or less the same as, what you're, whether you prefer playing with, whether you prefer Lionel train models or collecting Pokemon cards. It's
it's politically and socially irrelevant.
Yes, exactly.
This is something you cite even George Washington. He's speaking to, it's entitled "A Letter to Roman Catholics."
Yes.
And he says, and may the members of your society in America, animated alone by the pure spirit of Christianity, and still conducting themselves as faithful subjects of our free government, enjoy every temporal and spiritual felicity.
I've gotten in trouble for being a little too snarky about old George Washington on that one, but I think he's being a little snotty himself.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And you don't see those qualifications whenever they're talking to good old congregationalists or something like that. And so, I think you see from the very beginning, there's that sense that that we have to compromise. And hey, there are certain aspects of living in any society. I don't know if we talk about it in this book or not, but I know I've used recently the Epistle to Diognetus, and talks about how there's basically that Christians kind of blend into the world around them in non-essentials. The problem is that we have blended in the essentials.
Sure. You say that you describe the medieval notion of religion as being what is still pertinent and still cited by the Catechism of the Catholic Church as the true meaning of religion. Yeah. And what's fascinating is they don't describe it as a collection of beliefs at all. Right. On the contrary, they describe it as a virtue.
Yes.
So this, I think, is like the radically different thing, that when we say, oh, I have a religion, if we're following the teaching of the Catholic Church, we mean something entirely different than what people say when they say you have a religion. Yes. So can you define what are the implications of saying, well, what is religion as a virtue?
Sure. I mean, religion is traditionally considered, and this is where the title of the book comes from, an aspect of the virtue of justice. So religion is the virtue by which we do justice to God as far as we can with our own human limitations.
Right.
And so
give him what is due.
Exactly. So we give to God what is due to him. What is due to him is worship. What is due to him is love. What is due to him is our attempts to perfect ourselves as far as we possibly can. Obviously, but precisely by relying on him, and so whenever you twist religion into this kind of sociological phenomenon, it completely loses that aspect of justice, which is, it's not like also it's a medieval add-on to there's lots of kind of modern notions that the church kind of. There are various accretions to the faith that happen over time, and scholastics and so on. But the phrase, it is right and just, from the Mass, is attested at least to the 2nd or 3rd century.
Wow.
And so this idea that it is right and just to worship the Lord, that it is specifically just to worship the Lord, is there from the very beginning. And it also has, that idea of religion as justice is something that Christian thinkers took from the idea of natural religion that you see in the pre-Christian Rome.
Well, I think what's so frightening about saying, hey, religion is not a collection of beliefs, is actually an act of justice, is that everyone is obligated to be just, whereas not everyone is obligated, at least in our way of thinking, to have the same beliefs.
Yes.
So when you make that switch, like, oh no, this is what religion means now, you're implicating everyone within a society and not just those who confess the Catholic faith to be true.
Yes.
So, and you've said, you and Scott say this in the book, which is that once you take this definition of religion, you don't have the religious and the non-religious. You just have people who are not doing what they're supposed to do.
Yes,
They're not practicing the virtue of religion.
It's a great frame from which to see, the falseness of the notion of neutrality and secularism. Because if we see religion as if we see religion as a virtue, then just like any other virtue, you're either doing it or you're not. You can't be neutral. You can't be indifferent to the practice of virtue. You're either growing in it or you're growing in its inverse, in its vice. And so reorienting our understanding of what religion is really foundational to understanding the in a more complete way than just observing, although it's important to observe the problems with liberal neutrality. It gets to the heart of where that problem comes from.
I think one of the most radical chapters that has been written in any popular Catholic book in the last few decades is yours. Secularism is idolatry. I mean, and it really does come out to be a sort of climax in the book that you build up to. But secularism, the secular space, this understanding is, well, could you give us that argument again? I mean, in the chapters leading up to there, how you get there? I mean,
sure. So
if you don't remember because you wrote it a while ago, I can help out. But
when you mention this, I'm thinking of the meeting where Dr. Hahn and I were talking about this, and I remember the light bulbs going off in my head when he starts talking about this topic, and I'm like nodding my head and trying to keep up with him, which is not easy.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, if going off what we just said, that you're either that it's not a question of shall we be religious or not. Shall we organize our life or our society or our families or whatever around a notion of what is right and true and good, or shall we not? The question is, what notions of what is true shall we organize our life around? And once you see that, and once you realize that other notions of truth around which we organize our life other than the Blessed Trinity, other than the truth of Christ, the truth of the Church, are going to be false gods, then it falls into place, and it's just a question of saying it outright, and then of kind of taking the implications where they take you. Whenever we it's not new in the sense that we talk about. It's not a new thing to say that when we excise God from our lives or from our societies, we will, in a sense, worship profit or power or pleasure or perverse notions of justice that are trying to get at the real thing, but are failing to do so. There's nothing new about that, but just realizing that this is actually a kind of idolatry, that's the language that's new, and that it's necessary to whenever you pull out the idea of religion properly understood.
Well, I think this is probably the most insightful part of the book, because this point that you're bringing out, that if you don't have God, you're going to have a false God, you're going to have idolatry. You hear that from the pulpit quite frequently. But the thing that people don't bring with that claim is this understanding that of the political philosophy that we also praise and worship in America.
Yeah.
This understanding of liberalism, where according to fundamental anthropology, the way that we understand people and how we work is that you don't need to have that. And you're not going to have that necessarily. Right. But your claim is, no. If we're going to be good, honest, and integrated Catholics, we have to say these two claims, like what our government tells us, what American culture tells us, and what we hear from that average homily from the pulpit are completely mutually exclusive. Yeah. And the one from the pulpit is correct. So just realize that when it pertains to politics.
Yeah. I mean, so much of the project at this point, certainly in this book, and I think as I'm thinking about things, as Dr. Hahn's thinking about things, is making apparent those things, is saying outright those things that should be apparent, but that we're so used to the haze of secularism and liberalism that it's hard to see. And so even though on a brief analysis, on brief reflection, you can kind of come to the conclusion that you just came to. And this is kind of perhaps a played out image, a played out metaphor, but the fish doesn't realize it's swimming in water. We don't realize we're swimming in a sea of basically liberal idolatry, secular idolatry. And so it's really hard to see it. But once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a little bit of that liberal idolatry just as a test case. Because I think for a lot of people who hear this, that once you remove the true God as the object of your society's orientation and worship, that inevitably you have some other God in its place. That's the claim of idolatry. They're going to look around and say, well, okay, I think you're exaggerating.
Sure.
Sure, I can see how you value something of importance, right, instead of God. So in your book, you use examples of like the NFL replacing church on Sunday. Right. You've spoken of greed or rather profit and money as being. But it seems like for the average liberal, the reason that doesn't like immediately radicalize them, like, oh my gosh, I have an idol. It's because when they think of an idol, they think of something that fits those categories of religion that we began our discussion with, namely that it has supernatural qualities. Yeah. So if the thing is in fact natural, then it is not in fact a god, and then its pride of place in society is not idolatry. This is sort of and this is why I think it fails to convince people. Like you tell them, hey man, you're really worshiping money, and just translate it into a metaphor. I think money's great, but it's not. I'm not worshiping anything. So how do you defend yourself against that kind of pushback? That there's something about idolatry that would require something more mystical, something more divine feeling than the kind of lame things we replace God with.
No, it's a good question. I think first of all, I think the two things that immediately come to mind is that first of all, religion does not have to be supernatural in the sense that there does exist the concept of natural religion. Now we make a big case in the book that is insufficient, that you need revelation, that you need an element that goes beyond merely that goes beyond doing justice to the truth as far as human reason can discern it. But the natural world is something that is. The concept of religion can be applied and has been applied historically to the idea of the justice that we owe the natural world.
Right. So
then the other thing I would say would be that well, you go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna maybe say what you said in a way, but it seems like the claim that religion involves just the supernatural is false.
Right.
And so, if you're looking for only things like, oh, there's nothing levitating in this room, so there's no God. Right. It's like, well, you might be missing the point. But if the claim is false, and what's true is that religion is an orientation of justice towards the Creator by the mere fact that we're created out of pure gift, and we have things to do to give thanks, right? Yeah. Then it means that the practice of religion, right, involves our fundamental attitudes, not just like the things that we can't explain through sort of Enlightenment notions of nature, but our liturgy, the thing we spend our time contemplating, the thing we sacrifice ourselves for. I think this is really important. Like, what is the thing that in the end we die for, or sacrifice others for, or sacrifice our highest goods for? Like, those things are always present. Yes. Right. And it seems to me that it's precisely in order to avoid looking at that we make religion only have to do with the supernatural, because then we're like, see, we've got no gods, no idolatry here. Right. All we think about or care about or talk about is money, but there's no God because the money doesn't float.
I think, as an aside, I am curious about the phenomenon of the re-spiritualization of idolatry that is happening in small ways right now. But I don't want to overplay the idea of neo-paganism and things like that. But this idea of trying to re-spiritualize our commitments is coming back.
Did you read that New York Times article with the
spiritual consultants?
Oh my God! I made me want to jump out a window. So
no, I didn't. Tell me about it.
I'll introduce it very briefly. So it's basically there's consulting firms that are hired by like Fortune 500 companies to come and spiritualize the work environment.
Yeah.
The idea being that like making money is the true thing that Americans do. That's what defines us as a religious people. And we need to like acknowledge that and spiritualize it actively by developing little rituals. So like when you're all on a Zoom call, you know, together, you like sniff something together before you start. Or when you're fired, there's like a ceremony for being fired.
Did this begin as a satire and then they started making millions and ran with it, or?
You know, you never know. That's hopeful. That's why we keep Jacob around. He's looking at the bright side. So anyway, sorry. So
absolutely.
The re-spiritualization of that kind of humdrum religion,
right,
might be already happening.
Yeah, I think because people recognize the lack, they recognize the void, but then have no concept with which to fill it other than a spiritualized capitalism. That's frightening.
I mean, that is sort of frightening. But it is really interesting because one thing that Mark and I have kind of said quite a bit back and forth to one another is actually that line that C.S. Lewis said in his famous speech his inaugural speech at Cambridge, when he said that you're never going to find the prime minister pulling up a white ox on the steps of 10 Downing Street. Like, we're never going to ritualize our sacrificial systems. We're never going to ritualize our paganism again. But in this consulting case, I mean, that's like precisely what's you're starting to see the first seeds of that happening again. And, I'll just kind of add on there, because I know some of these concepts are strange, and it took me a while to be able to understand this. But in like the Aeneid, you have this like the quintessential attribute of Aeneas is his piety, which suggests some things about his orientation to the gods, but primarily about his duty to the country and to one another. That all of these things were mixed together, and when you find the ancient pagan notion of the Son of God before the scriptures took that over and truly Christianized it. It was somebody who was sat kind of in the middle between the material world and the invisible world, but between the two, it was all this kind of cosmic spectrum. There was no transcendence. There was no like holy other. It was just this kind of linear movement from lower to higher, and he just seemed to be a guy on the visible scale. The hinge of the visible scale, and I think that is. Where we have come back to when we talk about idolizing the world, is that once we have forgotten about the profound nature of God as holy other, as personal, yes, absolutely, but truly transcendent, then we really don't have any option but to go back to what is around us. And then to say, my duty, my like justice, the understanding of justice, my duty towards things, has to be ended at something, at some end, at some purpose, and then we start to systematize and reconstruct our culture in such a way that whatever we choose becomes our end, and then becomes the lifeblood of what we do.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing now in any number of facets of life is the breakdown of the idea of neutrality, the breakdown of the idea of relativism, the breakdown of the idea of progress for progress's sake. I think we're starting to emerge into a new kind of teleological notion, I think, of what society is supposed to be, but it's ordered towards these things like, these ideas of justice, like I said, that are getting at something real, but because they're untethered from other virtues and from an understanding of human limitation and most importantly, how could I untethered from grace, it becomes disordered and perverse. But at the same time, perhaps I'm speaking too abstractly, but I'll just speaking less abstractly. I think that a lot of the stuff that's happened this year with regard to racial justice is getting at something that's real and yet being untethered leads us to solutions or ways of thinking about the problems that end up going beyond the scope of what is prudent, and at the same time, precisely because of that kind of imbalance, it stirs up opposition that is itself often imbalanced because it refuses to recognize what is genuinely good there. And because of all of this, because it's kind of trying to put a little meat on the bones of the claim in the book that you have when you're failing individually and more importantly socially in the duties in the vertical axis and justice to God, the horizontal axis of justice to our fellow man falls apart. You need that grounding, or perhaps that anchor in heaven, and that grounding in virtue, again, not just individually, but as a society, to be able to redress injustice in a way that does not create further injustice.
Right. Yeah. This is such an important point.
And it's extremely frustrating to see the way this discourse goes, because if I saying what I just said, I get in trouble for opposing racial justice. But in acknowledging the good, even in some of the more radical claims of those who are pursuing racial justice, you end up in trouble for being too cozy with radicals. But the perverseness of the discourse, the fact that there's no ground that does not seem committed at some level to either expanding injustice or entrenching it, is precisely because we've lost the idea, which depends on grace, which depends on the virtue of religion as a social virtue and justice. That it depends on all that to understand that it's possible that justice is not a zero-sum game, that we can redress, it's possible to have reconciliation without recrimination. It's possible to have reconciliation without retribution. But at this point, it doesn't seem like there's any, whether we're talking about racial justice or economic justice or any other kind of justice that we are failing in some severe way. We can't imagine it as anything but a zero-sum game. Only retribution.
It makes sense in so far as if our eyes are turned away from God, then our attempts to simply have justice apart from God loses the character of God, which is mercy.
Right.
And so you end up making an idol of justice itself. And usually a very Christian idol, in the sense of like, it's only because of Christianity that you could have seen justice for innocent victims as something to make into an idol in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's important, it's important to acknowledge that goodness, to acknowledge that there's something that it's just, there's no kind of satisfactory place in the discourse right now for reconciliation.
Let's talk about, you mentioned religion as a social act.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a virtue of the individual, but only an individual in society. And you spend a good part of the book just saying that it's obvious that we're not individuals, we're families. And the individuals are sort of a extrapolation of the person apart from the family, but family is always there. It seems like people would listen to what you're saying and say, yeah, okay, we need to give what is due to God, thanksgiving, praise, and worship. I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
But the moment that you say, and this must be social,
right,
you run into this very practical problem, is that none of my friends want to. Or, to be less flippant, like, the state, our society,
right.
In what sense, and this is what seemed to be like something I wanted more from in the book, is in what sense are we supposed to have a virtue of religion as a social phenomenon if we live in a society in which its only principle is that there is no principle? Its only principle is that there is nothing that we're all supposed to be giving worship to. Right.
And I don't see, I'm not convinced by the idea that the obviously I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm not convinced by the notion that the state as currently constituted is really consecratable in the way that we're talking about. Everything, I suppose, is to some degree, but not in the way that we're speaking of here, in terms of actually, a Christian state would look very different. Would not just be this state that is staffed with Christians.
Yeah.
All right, we got it on record. Yeah, here.
But to be fair, some of that's a word game, right? Like when you say, it's not the state as it's currently configured. It's like, well, of course, conversion to Christianity is a reconfiguration of the thing you call a state. So
that's true.
I would hope that there's a common ground.
I completely agree. Yeah. But
I was claiming him for our side.
I was pushing back.
Oh, no, I'm gonna get in trouble. No.
These are niche issues. I wouldn't worry.
Yeah. We're all on the same side.
The thing is that is for me very far downstream. Now I know it's important. It's not. I don't mean to say, cross that bridge when we get to it. But before you can get to the point where you're talking about how does a society that is organized in some way politically in a state or in some sort of polity, how that goes about the everyday business of performing the duties and justice to God that form the virtue of religion. Just convincing people that justice, A, generally, and B, supernaturally, goes beyond the individual, in that it requires us as families to dedicate the family to God, and that it's possible to, for instance, dedicate friendships to God, that we can organize our lives beyond the scope of the individual and beyond the scope of the household. We can organize communities in such a way that they are more religious, more dedicated to justice, in the sense we're speaking of, than is generally allowed to be the case. And so, so I don't want to dismiss the importance of the nitty-gritty of the political question. I'm very interested in it. But to even get to that point, you need to convince people that it is, first of all, possible, and then second of all, good, to organize communities in such a way that it is more possible and more every day to worship, to pray together.
Yeah.
It is one of the things, like when Mark's saying, the major problem is that it's convincing your friends to go along with what you're saying. I think even, a problem that I've seen in conversations with most of my friends is not so much that they don't want to see a Christian society return. They do want to see a Christian society return, but there's some sort of a wall, a barrier that they come up against when we say, well, yeah, then we will get rid of the stock market. Or we'll get rid of our fractional reserve banking system, or you name all set of things, or you can't work at that store anymore, or like you really think you can put money behind Amazon, or you can go on these examples forever. And it's at that point where what they believe and how they act are they don't necessarily see a contradiction there, or they're willing to see a contradiction there. There's a place for further conversion that we're all going through and we're all finding in our lives.
Yeah.
But it seems like that is a sticking point of, there's a lot of people who are intellectually on board, and yet don't really want to look at how much this liberal society has changed the way that they live from how their Christian ancestors had lived.
Right. It's very hard to imagine what something else might look like. We're just so used to it. It's
yeah, that's so true.
And especially economically, we have been catechized to believe that the only other option on the table is the gulag, and so and this again goes to the idea, kind of what I was talking about before in terms of justice, that we recognize at some level things aren't quite right, that some people are treated not the way they should be, that it is possible, we recognize at some level, to distribute the goods of society more equitably. But precisely because we cannot imagine that occurring in a way that does not cause more problems than it solves, because we can only imagine it in terms of a zero-sum game, both in terms of the actual distribution of goods and in terms of kind of moral responsibility, if that makes sense, in that we can't imagine redistribution without punishment, without retribution. And so, it becomes very hard to imagine what does a world look like where exchange occurs, but it is not so institutionalized as to become the kind of motive force for all of human life. That just sets off communism bells.
Right.
So.
The sweet, alluring sound of communism bells.
It's like
and yet you still begin your book with Marx.
Right, I know. Yeah, we should be clear about what that's about, though.
Go for it.
Well, I don't want to get into too much. But it talks about the opium of the masses, and we just wanted to talk about how that he's actually getting at something real, and he's actually being in some ways complimentary. He twists it, Marx does. But that religion kind of makes life bearable for the proletariat by giving them something something to hold on to, and community, and in a supernatural frame for their suffering. And for him, of course, this something needs to be wiped away so the proletariat can come to understand their true position, and then so on and so forth. But it also relies, though, on that idea of religion as being, in the liberal frame, as being basically any sort of supernatural system that is a balm for the material reality.
One of the things I liked about your book is that when you take that notion of religion as a virtue, and then separate it away from that liberal notion of religion having to do with belief in the supernatural, that question of building actual communities that as social groups are orientated to God becomes way more palatable.
Yeah.
But what I mean by that is I'm no longer faced with this sort of terrifying prospect of like, okay, in order to orientate my neighborhood to Christ the King, I must get them all to join me in the procession around
Sure.
the town, which we should do. Absolutely. Right. But the point is that the work of justice, the work of having a community orientated towards Christ, already involves a lot of the things that we would previously have considered to be secular.
Sure.
Like making sure everyone has housing, like making sure that there's a way for a neighborhood to produce some of its own food, like a community. And you get the critique, like these are all like too small to be of real import. But what I think is they have this.
To be both.
Well, of course it has to be both, but it also has this kind of sacramental importance. It's like, okay, religious duty means giving everything to Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, and we can do that not excluding, but not simply in ways that we typically associate with like church. Yeah. Because you've just blown that category out of the water. Like there's no little church place that we go to, and the whole goal of integralism is to get everyone into that church place. It's like it starts with the recognition that the whole world, every aching part of it, is being drawn into the church. Yeah. And then what we're doing when we act with justice, when we invite our neighbors over, when we are showing them the faith and actually engaging with them in particular acts of justice that the church demands that we do,
the sacramental quality to that.
We're already doing it. And then it's just a matter of getting people all the way on board so we can join in the whole procession.
Acts of...
That was great all the way through. You kept that up.
Yeah.
Always
just like on the cover. We're just like on the cover of the book.
It is. Yeah. Oh, it's brilliant. Look.
There it is. Yes, the Rogation Day. Yep. Rogation Day procession. It's a beautiful painting.
It is.
It is. Yeah.
I'm brilliant.
Yeah,
I didn't know that until we sat down.
We're gonna set it up right. Oh, look at that. Oh, good. Okay. And just a very small example. Well, a very small example from my own life is, we have our neighborhood in Pittsburgh, got a bunch of young Catholic families are kind of moving to the neighborhood, and we have like a little chat group, and we have like a whole section for free giveaways. Mm-hmm. So not making a penny on it, just giving things away that you don't need anymore, or that you do need that someone else could use more than you could. We go together on, like, a few weeks ago, I went out to a bakery supply store north of Pittsburgh, and it's open to the public. We placed a big order on behalf of everyone, and I delivered enormous bags of flour and cornmeal. It's not self-sufficient in the way you're saying before, but just those little things, like we're going together to in organizing in some small ways the material basis for the community, on the basis of community rather than of the individual or even of the household.
Totally.
And that's it's a very small thing, but I say it because, first of all, I don't want people to think, oh, this is impossible for me. I don't know how to farm, blah, 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 blah. I have no interest in farming.
Revolution by incrementalism.
Right. Yeah. But just the idea, and that there would be, that no one's profiting from this. Mm-hmm. We perhaps even a bit more than, we went together and bought multiple cows from a farm that butchers their own meat, and divided among everyone, and everyone paid for their share, blah, 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 blah. But it was, but again, we're kind of, there's a small little sense of unity in that that goes beyond what is it goes beyond the purely abstracted notion of what we expect friendship to be.
And I think that any kind of further development to the point where you can imagine a state confessing Christ, or a nation orientating itself towards the truth in the kind of more exalted ways that we talk about, would rely on people having that experience.
Yes.
And this is what I think is really important. It's like, until you act as a community, you will never be the basis by which you act together as a nation. Right. And this is what I think already we see the problems of pretending that it's otherwise, because we have politicians and sort of state level actors that do things in the name of the nation, whereas as a nation, we're not unified. We're at each other's throats, it seems.
Right.
Or sometimes the contrary, where the assumption is that we're at each other's throats. On the state level, when you actually get to the neighborhood, everyone's fine.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I can be very pessimistic and very cynical about the state of our politics and our society. But that last point is very, very important. As much consternation as there is about certain aspects of the pandemic mitigation and et cetera, you go to a bakery in in your neighborhood or whatever, and people might be grumbling or whatever, but at the end of the day, people are not. There are a lot fewer incidents of people actually becoming upset and kind of divisive in actual life than there are spread in Twitter videos. And so even with the election, at times it felt like during the election that we were looking at the kind of level of breakup that was really much more of an acceleration than I even thought. And at the end of the day, though, as much as I do think that this year has been an accelerant for basically all trends that were currently happening, the actual lived experience of people in their everyday lives, in their neighborhoods, is not as fractious as it might seem if you spend most of your time, or too much of your time, on the internet.
Right, and the grounds for operating in peace as a community, operating in peace as a community, and on any level, is the grounds for understanding that we are made to worship God as a community. It's like, if we can pursue these goods together, why can we not pursue the good together?
Yeah. And so a lot of this book is about understanding that it is possible and desirable to pursue the good of God together, not just as individuals who happen to live together or happen to live near one another, but precisely as a community. And understanding that rightly understood goes back to something we're saying at the very, very beginning, where we do a good job of turning people into professing Catholics, but not so great a job of turning them into people who act with justice, who see the implications of that confession of faith in the material world, specifically when it comes to things like, economics and so on.
How you use your money.
Right. And I yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I hope that readers will get out of the book is the intrinsic connection between those kinds of justice.
Yeah.
We go to Mass, and part of the duties that we fulfill in that participation in the liturgy, part of related to that are the duties we have to our fellow man in justice, and that the two build one another up. I like the image of the cruciform, that the horizontal depends on the vertical, but at the same time, that horizontal axis does build up, can build up the vertical axis by reminding us what is possible.
Yeah, that's great. So everybody go out, buy the book, and who knows, Brandon or Scott might come to your door with a bag of flour. Brandon, thanks so much.
Yeah,
it was a great conversation.
Yep.
Have a good one.